everyone. Welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. We are making our way through season 10. I'm very happy to present to you today's conversation. Today, we're speaking to Kent Berridge. He is a pioneering affective neuroscientist whose work has transformed our understanding of motivation, pleasure, and addiction. As the George Packer Berry Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience at the University of Michigan, he is best known for disentangling the neural mechanisms of liking and wanting, fundamentally shifting how we understand reward processing in the brain. His research identifies hedonic hotspots in the brain that generate pleasure and shows that dopamine is more closely tied to desire and craving rather than the hedonic experience itself. I am so excited for today's conversation. How are you doing?
Great, and nice to be with you today, Gautam. I perhaps should say I'm the James Olds professor. There probably is a George Berry professor out there somewhere, but I'm the James Olds. He was the discoverer originally, James Olds, of reward centers in the brain. That is, sites in the brain where first rats would stimulate electrodes to turn on, and then later humans would do the same. So he was kind of a pioneer, James Olds, in the study of brain mechanisms of reward.
Oh, so what did he do with rats? Can you expand on that real quick?
Well, in the 1950s, Jim Olds and Peter Milner found that an electrode in just the right part of the brain of a rat that they thought would be an aversive electrode that the rat would not want to turn on. When they turned it on, the rat kept coming back to that place. And then later the rats would learn to press a lever to turn the electrode on. And that was the beginning of the discovery of reward circuitry in the brain.
And before then, we had no idea. How did we think pleasure worked before?
Before that, I think most theories in psychology and neuroscience were based on sort of the notion that drives were aversive, hunger and thirst, and other drives were aversive, and we wanted to reduce them. So rewards would reduce the aversiveness of hunger, the aversiveness of thirst, and the aversiveness of other things.
Interesting. I see. I always like asking this question, but I see a lot of books behind you. Out of those, what's been your favorite? What's been the most impactful on you out of the books that you have in the shelf behind you?
Well, there's a lot of great books, but I really recommend the books of Antonio Damasio on mind and brain, Joe Ledoux, and Michael Gazzaniga.
Are they still all alive or?
Yes, they are, as the last time I checked.
That's so cool. Nice. I mean, I feel like it's nice to be in fields that are a little bit more new because some of the most amazing work has been happening in our lifetime in the last few decades. And so you can still reach out to some of those people, which is always so fascinating. I feel like sometimes with education, some of the people I would love to speak to have long passed away, but it is something I would, but it's special. I think especially in psychology and psychiatry, right?
Yeah, I think it's an exciting time in neuroscience and psychology, the neuroscience of mind and brain. So absolutely, lots of people are still around.
Yeah. I mean, let's get into liking versus wanting. I think that is such an interesting kind of distinguishment between those two. So first, what was kind of the historical context behind separating those two? And then what did your research kind of show?
Well, originally, I didn't think they were separate. I thought that liking and wanting were basically two words, almost synonyms for reward, the effects of rewards. And most of us in the field decades ago thought there was sort of one unitary brain system of reward, and that could generate both the liking of the rewards, and since you like them, you'd want them. So liking and wanting from the same reward circuitry. And in the 1970s and 80s, the focus really became upon dopamine systems in the brain, mesolimbic dopamine systems that start in the midbrain and project up to the front of the brain, nucleus accumbens and other structures. And there was great evidence then that dopamine, and still is great evidence, that these dopamine systems were important in reward. We thought they were liking and wanting. And the best evidence really had come from animal studies by people, and especially the person who was the leader of this was Roy Wise in Montreal, Canada at the time. And he would show that if you gave drugs that suppressed dopamine, that the reward value of food and drugs and other rewards would, if you gave these drugs to rats, they would abandon those rewards. They'd stop working for them, the rewards of food or water or sex or drugs of abuse, if you suppressed the dopamine systems. And they gradually stop consuming the rewards. And he thought, well, look, they clearly don't want these rewards anymore. And probably the dopamine blockade has suppressed the pleasure, the liking of those rewards. So they don't like them anymore. And that's why they don't want them. I got into this debate originally as an assistant professor here, just arrived at the University of Michigan. Roy Wise called me up, and I was very impressed with his dopamine pleasure liking data. I would teach his dopamine pleasure hypothesis in my classes. And he said, well, you're doing something a little bit different to look at pleasure, and why don't we do a collaboration together, he suggested. I was looking at pleasure a little bit differently, using the way human parents have asked their human babies for taste pleasure. Does a baby like the kinds of foods that the parents eat? By giving the baby just a little taste of the food and seeing does the baby kind of smack its lips and lick and smile, or does the baby gape and shake its head and cry and shake its head? And that way you get a sense. Now, babies do that spontaneously to sweet things they like and bitter things they don't. Other primates, like apes, like chimpanzees or gorillas or other apes, show similar facial expressions. Monkeys show similar facial expressions. And it turns out that even rats, which are omnivores like humans, that is, they like all kinds of foods. They especially like sweet and fatty foods, and they don't like bitter foods. They have some of the same facial expressions. To sweetness, they'll sort of lick their lips, and to bitterness, they'll gape with a big opening of the mouth and shake their heads and shake their paws, rub their chins on the ground. So you get a sense of whether they like or dislike these tastes. And the question was, if we suppressed dopamine with Roy Wise, would the liking reactions to sugar, to sweet tastes, go down? And maybe even some aversive disgust reactions come up? That was the question. And we tried with dopamine blocking drugs, and we failed to produce that change. And I tried with other collaborators with other drugs to block dopamine, and it always failed. Other drugs could suppress liking. Opioid blocking drugs could suppress liking, and other drugs could enhance liking, but dopamine manipulations never seemed to change it. That was the beginning of a hint that maybe dopamine isn't so much about the liking of rewards, but it might be more about the wanting. Wasn't convinced myself. I began collaboration with a colleague at Michigan, Terry Robinson, who was doing lesions of the dopamine system in the brains of rats and exploring the effects of drugs on the brains. And he would find that so we collaborated, and we found together that if we did a dopamine lesion to take away dopamine completely from the brain, the rats no longer wanted food or water, but we could keep them in good health the way we'd be kept in good health in a hospital intensive care ward with artificial nourishment and hydration and such. Would they no longer like the taste then without any dopamine? And the answer was, even though they would never eat or drink voluntarily, they showed the proper facial expressions, and they could learn new likes or dislikes to taste even without dopamine. That was a moment when I almost began to believe that dopamine was more about wanting than liking. And the final clincher was when we started to turn on dopamine systems. We used Jim Old's electrodes that rats would work for. And if you just gave them those electrodes freely, if you just turned it on, the rats would make them want to eat. And the thought was that it make them want to eat because it's making them enjoy the taste of food more. It's a pleasure electrode. So the question was, if that's the case, and it did make them eat like 4 times more than usual, would it make them like the sugar more if we looked at their facial reactions? And the answer was it didn't. If we boosted dopamine with drugs, it didn't. If we boosted dopamine with other things, it didn't. So that was the beginning of the notion that dopamine was about wanting rewards, but it wasn't, after all, about liking. Something else in the brain was about liking. The field didn't really
Wow.
believe us, but eventually they kind of came around.
I have one analogy that I'm curious if it connects to this, which is oftentimes people say, I grew up in the Bay, and there was a lot of quote unquote good students and people who loved reading, for example. But the second you took them out of the school system, I mean, it's fascinating how almost none of those people now read anymore. And one thing that I was really fascinated by was it always like the desire for the grades, the affirmations, the kind of system that existed around how good you felt when you got the grades that like supported this entire behavior rather than an actual liking for the thing itself. Is that somewhat similar to what we're talking about here, where it was the wanting of that reward rather than it was liking the act itself?
I would say it's a little bit different. I mean, what you're describing is sort of doing something like reading in order to get something else, like good grades. So it's a wanting of the good grades that's driving you to read. But with this dopamine wanting liking, it's really the same target. It's the wanting of that thing you like. But if we just boost the dopamine, it boosts your wanting for that thing, but it doesn't change your liking of the thing. And this has implications for addiction because there are some people who may have sort of boosted dopamine systems kind of permanently that gives them a strong want, even if they don't like it any more than another person who can take it or leave it, who has a moderate want for it.
Whoa. So how would you go about I think the example of addiction is really helpful. How would you go about treating two people who where one person has a higher want and the other person has a higher liking for whatever it is, the addictive
Right.
substance?
Well, in a sense, a person who has a higher liking for a drug, in a sense, they're a rational addict. They are rational. They like it more and they want it more because they like it more. And when they get it, they enjoy it more. So there's reason. It's reasonable in that sense. But someone who has a heightened wanting for the drug and not a heightened liking, that becomes sort of an irrational want, because it's not, even if they don't like it much at all, the wanting can still be very, very intense. And that may confuse even them. They may not have an explanation for themselves of why they keep relapsing, when they sincerely want to stop taking the drug and they say, well, I don't really enjoy it anymore when I do take it. But there are moments when I just got to take it.
Hmm. And so how do you handle this from a psychology or psychiatry perspective when you're working with these different clients?
Well, I do basic research, laboratory kinds of research, so I don't actually deal with clients. But people who do, like psychiatrists, when Terry Robinson, my colleague, and I here first proposed our sort of dopamine-based theory of addiction, because Terry had been showing in animal studies that some individuals, not all, but some individuals who take addictive drugs like cocaine or heroin, everybody can show tolerance and withdrawal to those drugs, but some individuals show an opposite change in their brain, which is sensitization of their mesolimbic dopamine system. It means basically their dopamine system starts to become hyperreactive. It starts to become more activated by the drug and drug cues than it was in the beginning. And once this is induced, the sensitized hyperreactivity, you can stop taking the drugs for months and tolerance withdrawal goes away, but the sensitization doesn't go away. It's still hyperreactive to the drug cues. That's the kind of thing that can produce this sort of intense wanting that detaches from liking. When we first proposed the theory in the early 1990s, virtually nobody believed us, but one group who did was a group of psychiatrists who wrote letters to Terry and I saying, I have some patients who they're addicted. They want to not be addicted and they know it would ruin their life if they relapse. So they're seeing me and I'm trying to help them. And they do on occasion relapse and they say, I don't know why I'm doing it. I really want my normal life with my family and my job. I don't want to lose it all. I don't really enjoy these drugs that I'm taking very much anymore. And yet there are moments when I just can't resist doing it again. And I don't know why I'm doing that myself. Their patients would say to them more or less. These psychiatrists would write to us and say, you're offering us an explanation in this sensitization theory of dopamine that might account for what they're experiencing and why they experience it like that.
I mean, there's a few examples I can think of that personally apply this to me, and I feel like it does. What do you think are the implications of understanding this? You feel like it has helped with treatment in a lot of ways?
Well, it has helped with a better understanding of what the nature of addiction is for people who do become compulsively and persistently addicted to drugs. And there's some evidence it applies for some people in behavioral addictions too. So it gives a better understanding of what's going on in their mind and in their brain that could produce this. Um, Unfortunately, it doesn't automatically give you a better cure. We know what's happening, but there isn't quite a way to reach into the brain and just reverse it selectively in the way you'd want to make the problem go away once sensitization happens to these dopamine systems in the brain.
Hmm.
There's glimmerings of solutions on the horizon, but nothing in the near future, no.
And so when somebody's experiencing depression, for example, are they having a reduced amount of wanting or a reduced amount of liking?
Well, it's a good question. And, in psychiatry textbooks for decades, depression has been labeled as involving what's called anhedonia, depression anhedonia. And that means a lack of pleasure. And that means the patients with depression are saying there's just nothing in my life that's good anymore. There's, family, career, other things. No, it's not, it's worthless to me now. Um, that's a sign of anhedonia. In the last 10 years, knowing that liking and wanting can come apart, there have been sort of a second look, and it's turning out that in a number of cases, these people can give normal pleasure liking ratings to pleasures, but they don't have value to them. They don't want those things anyway, even if they are liked. Now, in some depression cases, there's true anhedonia too. Um, the cases where it's only the wanting suppression, some new terms like avolition have been suggested, a lack of will of wanting rather than anhedonia. This also happens in cases of Parkinson's disease and in schizophrenia, which also have labels of anhedonia in psychiatry textbooks. It turns out that a lot of those patients don't really have true anhedonia. They don't want the things, but they can actually have normal pleasure liking. So it gives an insight into a number of clinical conditions.
Yeah. And I think in some ways even from what you're saying, it feels like there's a lot of connections to education as well. I mean, to just teaching where identifying the reason someone doesn't necessarily connect with something could be from a want to learn versus just not a desire, I don't know, not a liking for the thing itself, right?
Sure. No, I think you're right. I mean, educators wish that their students would want to learn, to want to study these things and find them interesting and find them rewarding to study. So any ways they can do that to boost the incentive value of learning, that would be valuable to educators.
Mm. And so I want to transition into hedonic hotspots, which you talk about in your work as well. And so I know what each word individually means. What do they mean when you put them together like that?
Hedonic hotspots are special spots in the brain that are able to truly cause increases in liking, to truly generate pleasure. Spots of the brain that can truly generate pleasure. Basically, when Jim Olds decades ago had the electrode in the deep brain, he thought he had a hedonic hotspot. It turns out those electrodes often are not actually turning on pleasure, but they are turning on wanting to turn on the electrode by pressing the button, even in people, and to want other things like food and sex and other things when you turn those on. But there are systems in the brain that can control increased liking, true pleasure. When we were finding that dopamine wouldn't do it, we were also, and others were finding that opioid drugs like heroin or morphine, fentanyl, these do cause true pleasure liking. And they would even enhance the liking for taste. If we gave rats these opioid drugs, it would make them truly do more liking to the taste that we had originally hoped dopamine would do. So we knew opioids could cause liking and dopamine only caused wanting. But we didn't know whether there were any particular spots in the brain where opioids would cause liking. What we found as we started to put opioids in particular spots in the brain was that many sites in the brain, the opioids were failing to cause true liking. They were enhancing wanting, but only they were acting like dopamine. It was wanting without the liking. But in a few spots, they were enhancing both the liking and the wanting. These were the hedonic hotspots. And they're small spots distributed throughout across the brain. There's one in the nucleus accumbens, which is the major target of dopamine neurons, but also of opioid, has opioid neurons. Um, there's one in the prefrontal cortex, in the orbital frontal cortex, that's sort of above the eyes. There's one in the back of the cortex, the insula. There's some deep in the brain in structures. And if you turn one on with opioid microinjection right in that hotspot, it recruits the other hedonic hotspots together, all become active, and it increases the liking. In the animal studies, we can show it's increasing the liking of the taste. There's some evidence in human neuroimaging studies that these hotspots also light up in people who are enjoying various kinds of rewards, humor or foods or other things. So we think the hedonic hotspots, they're the special pleasure causing and maybe pleasure coding sites in the brain that are generating pleasure.
Now, I'm assuming in states of like flow, I'm assuming these hotspots are highly like what is the right word to use in psychology? Stimulated?
Well, I think that's a reasonable assumption. It is purely an assumption, and it's one I share, that in flow that might be activated. I don't actually know of any neuroimaging evidence where they've induced flow in a person. It's kind of hard to do when you're in a fMRI scanner in the hospital to get into that flow, I imagine. But it would be something that would be interesting to know if it were possible to do.
That's so interesting. And so, behaviorally, are there ways to stimulate this that isn't using opioids, for example?
Well, I think they're naturally turned on by things that we do enjoy. So, when all kinds of rewards in life, sensory rewards, but also cultural rewards, recruit activation in these sites. And that's what's giving the pleasure of those rewards when we do like them.
I guess I'm not sure if this is exactly in the context of your work, but it just came up in my mind and I'm curious to ask. But you can also go off, off your expertise if you'd want. But I'm just curious, how does our brain know what we like? Like how does it, yeah, what does it even mean to like something?
It's a good question. And it is the answer is that liking truly does come from the brain. It's not in the thing that we like. A kind of analogy is that there are keys in the world and there's locks in our brain, and some keys can unlock these pleasure circuits in the brain to cause them to be liked. Some things are sort of naturally biased to turn it on, like sweetness. Babies like sweetness, and a lot of human adults like sweet foods too. But the liking isn't actually in the sweetness, it's in the brain's response to the sweetness. So, for example, if you had a new sweet food that you really enjoyed, but then you got nausea right after, say from a flu bug that's not related to the food. A lot of people who experience this, a new tasty food, and then getting nausea afterwards, they develop what's called a learned taste aversion to the food. So the next time they taste it, it's disgusting to them, even though they loved it the first time. It's not a rational disgust, because you might even know that you had a flu and that the food was perfectly normal. But if it's a new food and it's paired with nausea, we're wired so that the pleasure drains from that thing in the future, and now it's disgusting. So the brain is deciding. It has some keys are sort of naturally biased and able, but the brain has flexibility and it can decide in the end to turn on pleasure to a new thing. So, for example, the
I
taste of
mean, how crazy
alcohol.
is that?
Well,
That's like it's like a
in a sense, it's
master.
crazy. That's right. So that's why we can start to enjoy alcohol and coffee and tobacco. For some people, tastes that were terrible for most people the first time they tasted each of those things, but some people come to enjoy them a lot. In a sense, that's kind of crazy and not even healthy. But the brain is adaptive so that we can learn new things to like. And in our evolutionary history, that was adaptive. A newly liked thing was often a valuable thing for our survival and perpetuation of our genes.
So, I guess the question I have is, okay, so let's say I taste I eat a piece of cake, and my question is, do I immediately feel the sensation of liking, or do I feel some sensation? Let's say I feel my heartbeat rising, I feel something else, and then I attribute that sensation to something I call liking.
Well, you get a sensation that's constant, that's stable. That's the sweetness sensation, say for a taste of food. But the liking of that sweetness, that's something that the brain is doing. A Dutch psychologist, Nico Frida called it the hedonic gloss. That gets put on a sensation. So some sensations are glossed with pleasure, other sensations are glossed with disgust or pain. These are things that the brain is doing to add something to the sensation.
And what is it that it's adding?
It's adding the hedonic tone. You either like it or you dislike it. It's adding that if it's recruiting this circuitry.
Hmm.
And the other related circuits in the brain are making you want them if you like. So, wanting and
More.
liking usually come on together. Most things come on in parallel, but as we've said, you can dissociate them, especially if you start playing with dopamine systems.
Could you also play with it if you have like a negative relationship with pleasure, for example, and then that means when you do like something, you would want it less?
Well, yes, I think that would be possible. I mean, what I'm thinking of are cases of like anorexia nervosa where people don't want to eat. And the question among researchers in who study anorexia nervosa is it that the pleasure of the food is really reduced, or is it that mostly it's a threat and it's still of great interest, but they do not want it kind of selectively, sort of more of a wanting change than a liking change. And I think both can happen, but I think there is some evidence that the wanting change is more powerful than the liking change.
Mm. So when you experience something that you like, does your brain immediately go to all your research, or do you actually enjoy the thing itself?
Well, I enjoy the thing itself. I know a little bit about what are the mechanisms that are causing these experiences, but it's still possible to live in the experience.
Nice. Because yeah, that is always that, I mean, this stuff is so fascinating because I mean, I think so much of our lives are dictated by this feeling. Whatever it is, liking that feeling drives so much of our behavior. And if you're able to understand it, you actually can kind of shift the way you do everything.
Yes, a number of philosophers have sort of proposed that pleasure and displeasure are sort of the chief driving forces in our life.
And so, I mean, is a lot of, I guess what I'm curious is what do you think this research leads to one day? So as we develop a deeper understanding of how our brain responds to what liking is, how it responds to pleasure, why we create it. What does the world look like maybe 1,000 years from now where this research has progressed?
Well, hopefully 1,000 years from now, there will be better cures for addictions. But I'd say what the work gives us is two kinds of things. One is better understanding of how our brain works, and also better understanding of how our mind works. I mean, originally, as I said, I thought liking and wanting were two words for the same kind of psychological process, but they're not. These processes are very different from each other, and they have particular features. It fragments further because this dopamine wanting is only one kind of wanting. It's the wanting that food gets you, drugs, people who take drugs, that makes them attractive. Things like sex, things like the face of a loved one can turn on this system. But if I want to lose weight and exercise more, that's not turning on my dopamine system. I may sincerely want it, but in a cognitive sense, but it's not an incentive that turns on the dopamine system. I don't want it in this more urgent incentive salient sense that dopamine gives. I wish I did, but I have to kind of make myself do those things. So there's multiple kinds of wants. We get insight into that from this work. There's differences between liking and wanting. That's the basic understanding. And I'd say, my real job as a basic kind of research psychologist and neuroscientist is to get a better understanding of what in the brain does what psychologically. You get a better understanding of the brain mechanisms, but also a better understanding of what it is that's being done psychologically, what these processes psychologically are actually. That's all in the first category. The second category are applications to human conditions. So things like addictions, better understanding of that. Things like anhedonia syndromes that are really avolition syndromes that we mentioned for schizophrenia or Parkinson's or depression. Some other insights too into clinical conditions. These gives us a better understanding of those, maybe empathy for the people with those conditions, and eventually maybe a way to get better cures or treatments for those conditions.
Hmm. I guess it's really interesting. Do you feel like even with addiction, Do you think that's a human experience that necessarily needs to be solved through the lens of neuroscience and psychiatry, or is it something that is more of obviously the answer is both, but is it more of like a community thing and like can you deal with these issues sociologically?
Well, sociology is important, and certainly it's well accepted that people growing up in certain kinds of communities are much more likely to take drugs than, say, kids growing up in other kinds of communities. Being deprived, having other resources in life, this can tilt you towards drugs or away from drugs. And also, it would be, I think I would want to say that most people who take things like addictive drugs, they don't actually become addicted to those drugs. There are lots of people who drink alcohol who are not alcoholics. There are some people who take harder drugs like cocaine or even opioids, and they can give them up. Some of the drugs like opioids can induce strong tolerance and withdrawal. So withdrawal symptoms are unpleasant. But if you can get a person through the withdrawals, since symptoms in a detox program or something, those individuals can walk away from the drug. And it turns out that most people who are taking addictive drugs in their late teens and early 20s, if you come back to them when they're, say, in their late 30s, approaching 40, most of them have given up the drugs that they were taking earlier in life. So they're not compulsively addicted in a long-term sense. But some people do become compulsively addicted. And these people can go through a detox program, be out of withdrawal, and still be very vulnerable to relapse when they come back into society. And these are the people who might say, I'm confused why I'm doing it, if I don't really like the drugs anymore, but I'm doing it. This becomes legitimately something that neuroscience and psychology and psychiatry have to deal with as a change in the brain that produces a change in the mind that creates levels of temptation the rest of us don't face. Even other people who are taking the same addictive drugs, they don't face that kind of sensitized temptation, that intense want that persists. So that's, in a sense, is a legitimate medical problem too.
Hmm. I
And I
mean,
would say, the kind of connecting it to the biomedical realm, medications have not been really great for addictions. The methadone is something you can take, and there's other versions of these substitutes, and some drugs will suppress cravings a little bit. But the best ones coming along the line, the best prospects now are the new GLP-1 agonists that people are taking to lose weight or for diabetes. And it turns out that when it suppresses cravings for food, in some individuals, it looks like it may also be suppressing cravings for drugs. And this is partly because they share some of the same mesolimbic systems. So if there are developing better biomedical treatments for compulsive cravings of food and other things, that's kind of saying, well, neuroscience and pharmacology have roles to play in helping people.
hmm. The I wanted to just touch back because this question came up again because to me when I think about the word liking, it just I mean it's kind of blowing my mind and I need to think about it for the rest of the couple weeks. But when I think about the word liking, to me the word like is a way for me to communicate to another person that whatever sensation I'm having, I want to have more of it or I'm enjoying it. But it doesn't seem to for me to be a way to actually express what I'm feeling, where it's just like I'm enjoying this. But in what you were saying, it felt like liking itself is a sensation.
It is an experience that can be put on a sensation, and it's a true experience. So you can have something and want to have more of it, and you can have that want with an intense pleasure liking experience. Or, as we've said through the dopamine manipulations, we can have that intense want even in the absence of an intense liking experience. So
Yeah.
they're happening often together in time, as you say, as you experience, but they are separable psychologically and they're separable in their brain mechanisms.
Yeah. I guess maybe what I was asking is I think this is like interesting. Like sadness, for example, is me communicating my understanding of certain sensations I'm having. the sensation I'm having is I'm feeling sweat and I'm feeling something else. And there's like a distaste for that sensation. And so I call it, I have learned, I've been socialized to call that group of sensation as sadness. And then I communicate to you, I'm feeling sad. But I'm not actually, since I'm not actually feeling sadness, I'm feeling just these like body changes. I'm just feeling my body responding in certain ways, right?
You're feeling your body respond in those ways, but you're also feeling your distaste for those bodily feelings that you're having. And that's what you're communicating. Now, sadness might not be the right word for it. Discomfort or something else might be a word, but it is affective. It's hedonic in this sense of being unpleasant to you. And so you're communicating that. You could have had the same
Mm,
sensations without the displeasure. You could have been sweating,
yeah.
hurting, and not minded that at all. Yet you do mind it. And so that's what you're adding.
And so is that part because I have dabbled in a little bit of Buddhist meditative practices. And so I'm curious, do you feel like that cognition of your senses can actually be you can't change your senses because those are just immediate. You can't really be like, I'm not gonna sweat. You can't really like force that to happen. But can you change the way you perceive that sensation?
Yes, I think that's true. Now, it's not easy to do, but it is possible to do that. And in meditation, it might actually occur in some individuals. I once had a conversation with Mathieu Ricard, who's a monk associated with the Dalai Lama in India and Tibet. Um, and he had said to me that he said, "Well, you're studying all these sensory pleasures, brain mechanisms for that." But he says, my best pleasure in life," he says, "is moments of bliss in deep meditation that he can attain." Um, and I asked him, "Well, is that truly a pleasure? Is it not just that you feel this is right and just the best way to exist, but is it actually a pleasurable experience?" He says, "Yes, but it's pure pleasure. It's not tainted with these other sensations that you're studying." And the question would be, for that person, can that pure pleasure light up the hedonic hotspots? And is that an experience that's shared? Mathieu Ricard has actually been in some neuroimaging experiments at the University of Wisconsin with Richie Davidson, who's a professor there, and it does sort of light up in sort of unusual patterns that could be involved in this. So I wouldn't rule out the possibility that there are, meditative and other psychological routes to experiencing these pleasures totally detached. And certainly things like music, humor, these are not sensory pleasures, but they do light up these same kind of brain systems.
Wow. How would you say a lot of your research has influenced the way that you navigate the world, maybe on a day-to-day basis?
Well, I imagine that most of the way I navigate the world hasn't changed that much based on these insights, but I think it gives me understanding and empathy for people who have the dissociations, in addictions and other cases too.
Yeah. I'm trying to think what, in terms of how to connect this to education. I mean, there are so many direct like ways to connect it, and I think the one that you said is really interesting, where oftentimes I think, especially in the last century, the way people talked about people who suffered from addiction was often just like a weakness in will, and it was just like you just can't. And I think over the years a certain level of empathy has been raised just about all the different complexities for why people may end up in these ways, and even understanding for ourselves, because I mean even this conversation has helped me understand certain things in my brain, but I just don't know what to do now with that information. So like let's say I know now, okay, I used to think it was because there's a few habits of my own that I do want to cut, but I'm like it's been, even though I know I hate doing them, I still do them. And so it seems to fall more into the wanting itself than it is the liking. But then now I'm like, now what?
Right. Well, it's wanting, but there's different kinds of wanting. I mean, as we said, the dopamine system responds to things like sensory rewards and cues for rewards, like the sight or sound of something that means reward. It responds to that. It also responds to little cue nuggets of things like social media, things that come at you quickly and short. It really responds to that. Whereas education is something that requires, you have to be interested in a more sustained fashion. For some kids, that sustained interest can light up the same brain circuitry perhaps. But for lots of kids, it doesn't, the more sustained. It's more like when I want to lose weight and exercise more. I have to make myself do it. So the question for educators is there any way to convert the sustained effort of studying and learning into a more system that activates this incentive salience dopamine once, that makes it intrinsically attractive and you want to do it.
Mm.
That's not my field to come up with ways to do it, but there are people who study that. For example, Suzanne Heedy in Ontario, Canada. She's an educational psychologist who's thought about these dopamine wanting issues and tried to apply it. She had a recent article published, her and Patrick Anselm, who's a Belgian psychologist and neuroscientist, on this subject. So you might want to talk with her on your podcast sometime.
Yeah, I wrote her name down. Yeah, that's amazing. But yeah, I mean, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your insights. And this was just so interesting. And I think conversation we've just been deepening our understanding on pleasure and the experience itself of pleasure, and it's been really cool. So I want to say thank you.
Well, you're welcome. I've enjoyed it too. Good luck with the podcasts.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to say thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. And as per usual, stay re-educated.